Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Her body was found 200 miles away in a forgotten Texas building. No signs of a struggle, no clear cause of death, no suspects until 17 years later when a whisper from a podcast cracked the silence wide open. October 4th, 2004. A commercial property manager in Winnie, Texas, unlocked the door to a vacant building scheduled for lease inspection. Inside, in the stifling air of a neglected back office, the scent hit him first. Decomposition layered with mildew. Then he saw what looked like a mannequin on the floor. It wasn't. Local authorities were called. Chambers County deputies arrived at the scene. The body was badly decomposed. Female, young, clothed. No visible gunshot wounds. No knife marks. No obvious signs of blunt force trauma. She had no wallet, no phone, no ID on her. No fingerprints could be recovered. She became a Jane Doe for 48 hours. Across state lines in Alexandria, Louisiana, Courtney Koko's family hadn't filed a missing persons report. She was 19, a college student, the kind of person who might disappear for a weekend. That's what her mother thought at first. Maybe a spontaneous trip with friends, maybe she needed space. But when the call came from Texas PD that they'd found a Louisiana driver's license, faded, bent, tucked in a pair of jeans still on the victim, everything stopped. It was her, Courtney Koko, born 1985, last seen by her family sometime between Friday night and early Saturday morning, October 2nd, 2004. Now dead, found dumped, far from home. No one could say exactly when she left. Her mother believed she was in her room late Friday. A friend recalled a phone call around 11 p.m. She never showed up for class Monday morning. Her car, a white Pontiac Grand Am, was missing. When Texas investigators traced the ID back to Rapides Parish, jurisdictionally the case shifted. Winnie PD handed over findings to Alexandria Police Department. Their forensics team, led by Detective Larry Kavanaugh, began the long process of mapping a case that had no beginning. The autopsy was inconclusive. Courtney's body had been in advanced decomposition, possibly left in the open for 2 to 4 days before discovery. The medical examiner found no lethal injuries. Toxicology came back with traces of tramadol, MDMA, and ethanol. Low concentration, not fatal by themselves. The official cause of death, undetermined. Undetermined meant everything and nothing. It meant there was no definitive physical trauma. It meant no forensic lead. It meant her death, though suspicious, could not yet be legally called a homicide. And that's where most cases stall, but not this one. Investigators returned to the Koko residence. The house was neat, nothing broken, no signs of a forced entry. But something was missing. The mother, she noticed it when they asked about Courtney's last known possessions. Her favorite leopard print blanket was gone. So was the bathroom curtain in the hallway bathroom, the one closest to Courtney's room. Not stolen, not in the laundry, just gone. Detective Kavanaugh logged it as odd, but not useful. Yet. Neighbors were questioned. One recalled seeing Courtney's white Grand Am parked outside until around 4:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. Another said they thought they heard a door slam around that time, but didn't investigate. No security cameras in the neighborhood. No surveillance footage from local gas stations along the interstate matching her vehicle. The car itself wouldn't surface for another 2 days. It was found abandoned near a construction site in a rural stretch between I-10 and State Highway 124, roughly 40 miles from where her body had been located. No prints, no blood. The keys were missing. Inside the vehicle, one black hair tie, an empty water bottle, and a flyer from the Louisiana College homecoming football game. The backseat had been wiped down with a strong-smelling cleanser. Forensics confirmed it. Bleach compound. There were no drag marks on the site where Courtney was found, suggesting she'd been carried or deposited carefully. One responding officer remarked, "It was as if she'd just been placed there, like whoever left her didn't want a scene." Nothing screamed rage. Nothing indicated panic. It was controlled. When local media caught the story, the headline was simple: Louisiana college student found dead in Texas. No suspects. Back home, her friends and family gathered for a candlelight vigil. At the university campus, professors remembered her as bright, engaged, but reserved. A quiet kind of student, not the type to disappear, not the type to party hard, not the type to use drugs. And yet, there were whispers. A former classmate mentioned a rumor, something about an older man, someone she shouldn't have been seeing. He was connected to the family, I think, she said. It was messy. Nothing was confirmed, no full name, no address, just talk. Still, detectives noted the suggestion. Any past relationships could be relevant, especially if there was conflict. But without cause of death, without a crime scene, and without a suspect, it was filed into the growing list of leads without evidence. They had nothing to charge, nothing to hold anyone on, and Courtney Koko became another entry in the cold case log. In cases like these, family backgrounds aren't just filler, they're part of the investigation. Who knew the victim? Who had access? Who had opportunity? And more importantly, who had motive? Courtney Koko was born in 1985 and raised in Alexandria, Louisiana. She was 19 at the time of her death. At the time of her disappearance in early October 2004, she was a part-time criminal justice student at Northwestern State University. She lived with her mother and younger sister in a modest home in a quiet subdivision. Her father was no longer present. The household was described as stable but private. According to friends and faculty, Courtney was polite, reserved, and often kept to herself. No disciplinary record, no run-ins with law enforcement, no drug history on record, nothing unusual, but something didn't track. Detectives reviewed her academic attendance records. She'd missed class once in the week leading up to her death, something she hadn't done before. No call, no email, no explanation. One classmate reported she seemed distracted in her last criminology lecture. That's not evidence, but it's a deviation. Investigators noted it. Her phone records offered little. There were no outgoing calls or texts after Friday night, October 1st. The last ping registered from a tower near her home at approximately 4:17 a.m. on Saturday. The phone went dark after that. It was recovered from her bedroom drawer, unused, fully charged. That contradicted early media speculation that she had run off or planned to leave town. You don't leave your phone behind when you're fleeing or meeting someone. Her bank activity was clean, no unusual withdrawals. Her debit card was last used Friday evening at a gas station less than a mile from her house. The transaction? $20 for fuel, no surveillance footage available. The gas station had no working cameras in 2004. That same Friday, she told her sister she was staying in. According to family, she was wearing a hoodie, sweatpants, and was winding down for the night. She wasn't dressed to go out, but she left at some point before dawn. Her car was gone when her mother woke up Saturday morning. No signs of forced entry, no indications of a break-in. But something in the layout of her room felt off. Her leopard print blanket, always folded at the end of her bed, was missing. So was a bathroom curtain, torn off its hooks. Those items weren't immediately flagged as evidence, not until much later, but in retrospect, they were early indicators of movement, of an attempt to clean or conceal. Detectives ran interviews across her social circle. A friend from campus said Courtney had mentioned wanting to get away from someone. No name was provided. Another source claimed she'd recently ended an off-the-record relationship with an older man, someone connected to the family. The implication was vague. The witness wasn't willing to go on the record. But the pattern started to emerge. People knew something, but no one would commit to specifics. Detective Larry Kavanaugh flagged the term "connected to the family" as potentially significant. That phrasing often showed up in domestic-related homicides. It suggested overlap, someone with social access but who could still move undetected. The department pulled old police reports involving anyone close to Courtney. No active restraining orders, no calls for domestic violence. But there was a 2002 complaint filed against a man named David A. Burns. At the time, it had been a domestic battery charge involving a former partner. It never made it to court, dismissed without prosecution, but Kavanaugh flagged the name. Burns was known to the Koko family. He'd previously dated Courtney's older sister, Lace. They had once been engaged. At this stage, no direct connection between Burns and Courtney was confirmed, but the potential for proximity raised red flags. Investigators requested his cell tower data from October 1st, 4th, 2004. The telecom provider didn't retain records that far back. Standard retention protocols at the time were 13 months. The request hit a dead end. Instead, detectives interviewed Lace Koko. She was calm, cooperative, but hesitant. When asked if her ex-fiancé ever interacted with Courtney, she paused, then said, "Not really, not alone." When asked if they were ever close, she responded, "Not that I know of." That phrasing was noted. Not denial, just distance. A separate line of inquiry opened up when a colleague of Courtney's at a part-time dental receptionist job told investigators that she once saw a guy in a white truck parked outside the clinic watching the building after closing. She didn't recognize him. She couldn't describe him. But she remembered Courtney locking the door twice that day, even though she usually left it open during cleaning. Again, not evidence, but again, a pattern that didn't fit. The full psychological profile wasn't developed yet, but the investigative angle was leaning increasingly domestic. No forced entry, no theft, no ransom demand. The blanket, the curtain, the location, the bleach. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. And still, no physical link. The case was cold, but not dead. It just needed time. Sometimes the evidence isn't ready when you are. In towns like Alexandria, Louisiana, murders aren't just crimes. They puncture the trust people have in familiarity. And in Courtney Koko's case, what looked familiar might have been the most dangerous part. The first 48 hours are critical. Every investigator knows this. But with Courtney Koko, that window closed before the case even opened. By the time her body was identified, the trail had already gone cold. Back in Alexandria, Louisiana, the local department was under pressure. The case had made regional headlines. A young woman, barely 19, was dead, dumped in another state. No known enemies, no clear motive, and no working theory that stuck. At first, investigators did what they could with what they had. They conducted standard interviews. Family members, neighbors, classmates, co-workers. The goal was to establish a timeline, but there wasn't one. The gap between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of her body was unaccounted for. The problem wasn't that no one knew what happened. The problem was that too many people assumed she was fine until she wasn't. Courtney's car had already been found, abandoned and wiped clean. No prints, no blood. The bleach residue in the back seat was noted in the vehicle report, but without additional forensic context, it remained circumstantial. The trunk liner had been stripped, missing. Another detail flagged as unusual, but not actionable. Investigators looked into her phone. The records were limited. She hadn't texted or called anyone after midnight Friday. That cut off any chance of tracing last known contacts. There were no third-party apps to ping. This was 2004, long before location sharing or constant device tracking. The phone itself had been powered off and left at home. No defensive wounds on the body, no ligature marks, no signs of restraint. The medical examiner noted moderate post-mortem bloating, an estimated time of death as likely within 24 to 48 hours prior to discovery. That placed it somewhere between Saturday afternoon and Sunday night. But given the state of decomposition and the lack of environmental control in the building where she was found, the margin for error was high. One report from Chambers County, Texas, did mention a local man named Wilson. He lived near the abandoned building where Courtney's remains were discovered. According to a deputy, Wilson called in a tip. He claimed to have seen a white Pontiac parked along the road late Saturday night with a man standing near the back. He didn't see the license plate. He didn't get close. It looked like the car had mechanical trouble. He didn't report it until news of the discovery broke. The Alexandria team noted the tip, but it didn't lead anywhere. Without a plate match or a positive ID on the driver, it was filed away. No follow-up. Wilson wasn't interviewed again for over a decade. Internal notes later revealed something else. The forensic lab handling the limited evidence from the car experienced a backlog. Multiple samples, including trace fibers and chemical residues, were never tested. Some degraded before they could be processed. Others were returned as inconclusive. Chain of custody was preserved, but there was no push for retesting. Budget limitations were cited. Meanwhile, public interest faded. After a few weeks, local outlets stopped running the story. No press conferences, no updates, no arrests. By early 2005, the case was formally classified as inactive. Not closed, not solved, just shelved. The term cold case didn't officially apply yet, but for all practical purposes, that's what it became. Internally, a quiet dispute unfolded within the department. One investigator pushed for a deeper look into potential domestic links, specifically connections to individuals with past involvement with the Koko family. But without probable cause, those names never made it past informal discussion. The most consistent issue was the absence of a crime scene. The place Courtney was found wasn't where she died. The apartment she lived in showed no struggle, and the car? Sanitized. No fingerprints matched anyone in the system, no DNA hits. What the case lacked wasn't effort, it was evidence and time. For the family, the silence became unbearable. Her mother began recording details herself, names, dates, anything she thought could help. A personal logbook, separate from the official report. Years later, that log would contain details no detective had written down. In 2006, a new detective briefly revisited the file. He flagged one note from the original paperwork. A former friend of Courtney's had told a teacher she believed someone close to Courtney had something to hide. The statement had never been formally followed up. It wouldn't be until much later, years later, that those loose threads would be pulled again. By then, the momentum would come from outside the system. Sometimes cases don't fall apart because people stop caring. They fall apart because no one has the tools to keep them together. By 2019, the Courtney Koko file had been dormant for nearly 15 years. It wasn't closed, but it wasn't moving either. No suspects, no active leads. The physical evidence had either degraded or gone stale. Internally, the case had cycled through 3 different detectives and been deprioritized amid higher volume caseloads. But what law enforcement hadn't done, a podcast did. In April of that year, a Louisiana-based true crime podcast, Real Life, Real Crime, featured Courtney's case in a multi-part episode. The host, a former sheriff's detective with local connections, laid out the failures in the original investigation, naming missed witnesses and suggesting specific individuals who may have had access to Courtney shortly before her death. He didn't make accusations, but he made one thing clear. The case wasn't beyond saving. That podcast didn't introduce new physical evidence. What it did was resurface old information, then give it amplification. The episode reached tens of thousands of listeners across the state. Among them were people who knew Courtney, knew the family, or had seen something they didn't realize was relevant back in 2004. Within 3 weeks of the episode airing, Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office received 3 new tips. One stood out. A man from Texas, who had previously declined to make a formal statement, contacted investigators and offered details about a conversation he'd overheard in 2005. According to his account, a person known to the Koko family had admitted, while intoxicated, to having put her in the backseat himself. He hadn't believed it at the time, but hearing the podcast episode triggered a reassessment. He now believed it was a confession. This statement, combined with the increased scrutiny around the case, prompted law enforcement to reevaluate the file. A task force was formed that included detectives from Rapides Parish, the Louisiana State Police, and forensic analysts from a neighboring jurisdiction. The first priority, reprocess what remained in evidence storage. The Pontiac Grand Am, long since released from impound, was no longer available, but trace materials had been archived. Investigators recovered a sample of the bleach-stained fabric from the vehicle's rear seat, along with a sealed vacuum bag containing carpet fiber and hair strands. These samples had not been analyzed in 2004 due to budget constraints. In 2019, with new lab funding and updated forensic technology, they were retested. One sample produced a viable mitochondrial DNA sequence. It was female, consistent with Courtney. Another fiber retrieved from a fragment of the missing blanket showed trace male DNA, but only a partial profile. Still, it was enough to enter into CODIS. No match came back immediately, but the partial was stored for future comparison. Detectives then went back to a name that had circulated in rumors since the beginning. David Anthony Burns. He had never been interviewed formally. His name had been mentioned in passing during the initial investigation, but without cause, no further action had been taken. In the reopened case file, however, Burns presented as a logical person of interest. He had ties to the family. He was once engaged to Courtney's sister. He had a 2002 domestic violence report in the system, later dropped. And now someone claimed he had admitted to transporting the body. Detectives brought in Burns for a voluntary interview. He denied knowing anything about Courtney's death, claimed he hadn't spoken to her in years, said he was home the entire weekend of her disappearance. When asked for an alibi, he couldn't provide specifics. His memory, he said, was foggy. That answer didn't help or hurt the case directly, but it was entered into record. Separately, forensic investigators contacted the Chambers County Sheriff's Office in Texas to review the crime scene documentation. One minor detail resurfaced: the way Courtney's body had been positioned in the abandoned building. She hadn't been dragged. There were no scuff marks, no signs of post-mortem trauma. She had been carried in, placed down, and left. That behavior, controlled, methodical, suggested familiarity with her, not random violence, not panic. The task force issued a new call for public information. Among the responses was a second individual who had known Burns socially in the early 2000s. She claimed he once made a comment that someone would never be found if he handled it right. Not a confession, but now in context, it added weight. The pieces were not yet enough to press charges, but for the first time since 2004, the case had momentum. The silence that had clouded the investigation had been disrupted by a recording and a few people who finally spoke. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in public attention. Sometimes that's what wakes the system up. By the end of 2019, the momentum surrounding Courtney Koko's case had shifted from passive remembrance to active inquiry. The forensic reevaluation in Chapter 4 hadn't produced a full DNA match, but it had yielded a partial profile, enough for comparison, enough to hold on to. The task force now focused on aligning witness accounts with physical timelines. The most critical of those accounts came from a man who claimed, in confidence, that he once heard a key figure associated with Courtney's family admit to placing her in the car. At the time, he brushed it off. 15 years later, he couldn't. This time, investigators documented it thoroughly. He gave a written statement, passed a credibility screening, and answered follow-ups under oath. His timeline aligned with Courtney's disappearance. His description of the individual's wording wasn't exaggerated. It was specific, intentional. "I carried her myself," the man recalled hearing. It wasn't hearsay anymore. It was actionable. The focus returned to David Burns. Burns had denied involvement, denied contact, claimed he hadn't seen Courtney for years before her death. But new digital forensic methods offered a chance to test that. A subpoena was issued for cell tower triangulation records, not from 2004, which no longer existed, but from 2005 onward. Analysts checked for patterns. They discovered that Burns had traveled the I-10 corridor between Alexandria and Winnie, Texas, on at least 6 occasions in the year following Courtney's death. Always at night, always alone, no registered hotel stays, no work-related reason. The travel itself didn't prove guilt, but for someone claiming no knowledge or connection to the location where Courtney's body was found, it raised flags. Simultaneously, the FBI's regional lab in Quantico reanalyzed a swab from the passenger side door panel of Courtney's car. Previously unreadable, advances in trace extraction made it viable. A low-yield profile was pulled. Male, partial, and when compared against the partial from the blanket sample, it was consistent. Not a match, but consistent. Statistically rare enough to narrow suspects. Statistically rare enough to warrant pressure. Investigators also requested data from a secondary witness, a woman who had dated Burns briefly in 2005. She recalled an incident where he became agitated during a conversation about girls who don't know when to let things go. She didn't report it then, but she remembered it now. And what she remembered lined up with what the task force already had. Still, prosecutors needed more. The case had no direct confession, no murder weapon, no conclusive K.O.D., but it did have behavior, timeline contradiction, and a pattern of statements that shifted under pressure. One final angle was pursued: location intelligence. Using historical satellite imaging and archived construction logs, Investigators determined that the building where Courtney's body was found had been boarded up weeks before the discovery. The window used to access the room where her body was placed had pry marks, dated by oxidation, matching the estimated time of death. Whoever left her there knew the building, knew how to get in quietly, and had time to plan it. The theory solidified. Courtney didn't die in Texas. She died in Alexandria, transported post-mortem, left carefully, hidden for as long as possible. And the person who did it had waited years, convinced they had succeeded in erasing every trace. They hadn't. Sometimes evidence doesn't speak until someone listens differently. In April 2021, the Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office submitted their final case review to the District Attorney's Office. After 17 years of gaps, dead ends, and delays, the case file on Courtney Koko had finally met the burden of probable cause. It didn't happen because of a single confession. There was no DNA slam dunk, no recovered murder weapon. What they had was a pattern: overlapping forensic data, travel inconsistencies, corroborated witness statements, and documented lies. Prosecutors determined that together, it painted a legally sufficient picture. It was enough for an arrest warrant. The arrest was executed quietly. David Anthony Burns was taken into custody on April 13, 2021, in Rapides Parish, without incident. He was 43 years old. He offered no comment at the time of booking. The charge, second-degree murder. Burns's name had hovered around the edges of the case for years, mentioned in whispers, family tension, and speculative forums. But until this point, there had never been enough evidence to formally accuse him. Now investigators had assembled a circumstantial net strong enough to hold. Among the key components submitted with the indictment request, the 2019 partial DNA match between a male sample on Courtney's recovered blanket and a similar trace from the interior of her car. Contradictions in Burns's 2019 voluntary interview, where he denied traveling to Texas, contradicted by phone-based travel pattern analysis. Witness testimony from two individuals who recalled admissions made by Burns in the mid-2000s, both describing the act of carrying her body. Evidence showing Courtney's last known interaction pattern included proximity to Burns' social circle. Forensic assessment of the abandoned building in Winnie, Texas, confirming that forced access through the rear window aligned with the time of death. None of these on their own was definitive, but in totality they formed a sequence, one that could be argued before a jury. The lead prosecutor didn't hold a press conference. Not at first. There was caution. The case was old. The evidence was complex. And there was no physical scene that could be reconstructed. Still, for Courtney's family, the arrest marked the first official recognition that what they believed all along, that their daughter had been murdered, was finally acknowledged by the state. In preparation for trial, detectives reviewed all previous interviews with Burns and re-interviewed close connections. They looked for statements that could be compared to new forensic reports. Inconsistencies were found. During a 2006 private conversation with an ex-girlfriend, Burns had reportedly said, "No one ever found out what really happened to her." That comment, when viewed alone, meant little. But when paired with evidence of concealment, bleach, and silence, it supported intent. The forensic retesting also identified secondary touch DNA, very low yield but present, on the seatbelt latch of the passenger side of Courtney's vehicle. It was consistent with Burns's profile, but did not meet the statistical threshold for courtroom introduction. Prosecutors chose not to rely on it, but noted its relevance in the timeline. Trial preparation also included evidence sequencing. Investigators had to demonstrate how the absence of evidence in the first decade was the result of gaps in funding and lab capacity, not incompetence. This was crucial. The defense strategy would center around the idea that no one cared about the case until a podcast made it popular. The state needed to show that the science, not public pressure, drove the case forward. And scientifically, the core was sound. Trace DNA, behavioral inconsistency, opportunity, and a pattern of deliberate evasion. It wasn't dramatic. It was built brick by brick. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, without headlines, without a moment of cinematic revelation, just paperwork, timing, and a team unwilling to let a name disappear from the file cabinet. On October 24, 2022, The trial of David Anthony Burns began in Rapides Parish, Louisiana. Jury selection took 2 days. Opening statements were concise. The prosecution didn't rely on theatrics. They leaned on chronology, forensics, and contradiction. There was no body cam footage, no confession tape. What they had was structure, a pattern of behavior, and 17 years of documentation that had finally been organized into a single, prosecutable timeline. The courtroom was ordinary, no cameras, no media frenzy. What unfolded inside was built on years of forensic backlog and patient evidence management. The prosecution's first move was methodical: establish the victim. Courtney Koko, 19, last seen alive in Alexandria, Louisiana, on the morning of October 2, 2004. Her body was discovered 2 days later, 200 miles away, in an abandoned commercial property in Winnie, Texas. The autopsy was inconclusive. No cause of death could be determined. But toxicology revealed only trace substances. The death had been classified as suspicious but unconfirmed. For years, that ambiguity stalled the case. Then the state walked jurors through what changed. A forensic analyst testified regarding the 2019 DNA retesting process. A partial male DNA profile had been developed from a blanket found with the victim and from a panel in her vehicle. The two samples were consistent with each other. Neither could produce a full match, but both had alleles found in David Burns's profile. The probability of that combination occurring by random chance, they argued, was low, statistically rare in the population. The court accepted the expert's foundation for admission. The DNA didn't solve the case, but it moved it. Next came the travel records. A geolocation expert presented a compiled map showing Burns's historical movement between Rapides Parish and Southeast Texas in the 12 months after Courtney's death. There were at least 6 trips, none tied to employment or family. The timeline correlated with moments when news coverage about the case resurfaced. The implication was clear. He monitored proximity. He wanted to know what investigators might see. Then the testimony turned personal. 2 independent witnesses, each with no incentive to lie, stated under oath that Burns had made incriminating statements in the mid-2000s. One had heard him say, "I put her in the car myself." The other remembered a threat made during an argument: "She wouldn't be found if I handled it." In isolation, either quote could be dismissed, but paired with forensic inconsistencies and a verified lack of alibi, they carried weight. The defense strategy hinged on absence. No murder weapon, no time of death. No physical location linking Burns to the moment Courtney died. They suggested the evidence was circumstantial. They questioned the reliability of degraded DNA. They argued that memories after 15 years were unreliable. Their narrative was simple. The case was built on suspicion, not fact. But the prosecution returned to what they called forensic consistency over time. They showed how Burns's statements to investigators in 2019 contradicted prior known facts. He denied knowing where Winnie, Texas was, despite having traveled there multiple times. He claimed he hadn't seen Courtney in years, though his phone records showed presence near her home in late September 2004. One detail delivered by the state stood out. The curtain missing from the Koko household bathroom, logged in the initial case notes in 2004, was never recovered, but fibers consistent with that curtain's brand and weave were found in the trunk lining of Courtney's vehicle. It had been overlooked in early lab testing. The finding didn't draw direct blood evidence, but it linked a missing household item to the transport of the body. Quiet, precise, intentional. The closing argument from the prosecution avoided emotional appeal. It followed one line: "This is not about one perfect piece of proof. It's about a man who erased what he could, but missed what he couldn't. And those details brought him back here." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty, second-degree murder, mandatory life sentence, no parole. David Burns showed no reaction as the verdict was read, no apology, no statement. His legal team filed an intent to appeal, citing insufficiency of evidence and prejudicial delay in prosecution. But for the court and for Courtney Koko's family, the judgment stood. There had never been a scene, but there had been a murder, and now there was a conviction. On November 28, 2022, inside a courtroom in Rapides Parish, David Anthony Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no dramatics, no outbursts. The words from the bench were measured and final. It marked the legal end of a case that had gone unsolved for 18 years. The courtroom wasn't filled with reporters. It was mostly quiet, except for Courtney Koko's family. Her mother sat in the front row, her sister Lace nearby. They listened as the sentence was read, not with celebration, but with something closer to exhaustion. The system had finally said what they knew all along. Courtney had been murdered, and now someone was being held responsible. Burns declined to make a statement before sentencing. His legal team filed a formal notice of appeal the following month. In December 2023, that appeal was denied by the Louisiana Third Circuit Court of Appeal. The court upheld the original conviction, finding that the evidence, though circumstantial, was lawfully obtained, legally sufficient, and supported by years of cumulative testimony, forensic reanalysis, and investigative consistency. That ruling closed the last procedural door for Burns. There would be no parole, no retrial, no new hearing. But while the legal system reached its conclusion, the echoes of the case extended beyond the courtroom. For investigators, the Koko case became a quiet template, how cold cases can move forward with persistence and method. There was no single breakthrough. It wasn't about fingerprints or cameras. It was about pieces, small, often overlooked details, collected, compared, and matched until the margin for doubt was too narrow to ignore. For the forensic community, it reinforced the value of archived evidence. The fibers preserved from Courtney's blanket, the latent DNA stored from her vehicle, all of it was processed years after her death using techniques that didn't exist in 2004. None of the samples had been smoking guns, but collectively, they closed the distance between speculation and conviction. For Courtney's family, the verdict didn't erase what happened. It didn't return a daughter or fix the time lost, but it did provide something critical: public recognition of what they had carried privately for nearly 2 decades, that their daughter mattered, that her name didn't get buried with her. In 2024, a scholarship fund was quietly created in Courtney's name at Northwestern State University, where she had been a criminal justice student. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't designed to, but it became part of her legacy, a way to tether her story to a path forward for others. The podcast that helped reignite the investigation, Real Life, Real Crime, went on to feature other cold cases. The Koko case became a reference point, not for the drama, but for the outcome. It was proof that silence doesn't mean closure, and time doesn't erase responsibility. What the case leaves behind is a clear, if sobering, reminder. Some crimes don't reveal themselves immediately. Some truths stay buried in files, behind faulty assumptions or incomplete lab results. But when revisited with precision, and when people choose to speak instead of stay silent, those truths surface. Justice doesn't always come quickly, and it doesn't always come clean. But in Courtney Koko's case, it came. They say justice delayed is justice denied. But sometimes justice just takes a longer road. If there's one thing I've learned walking through this case with you, it's that silence doesn't mean closure, and time doesn't mean truth fades. I share this not just as a storyteller, but as someone who believes every overlooked detail deserves a second look, and every forgotten voice deserves to be heard. What do you think this case says about how we treat cold cases, or the people left behind? Do you think justice came too late, or just in time? If this story touched something in you, let me know in the comments. Share where you're watching from, or what part hit home. And if you didn't connect with it, that's okay too. Tell me why. If you're still here, I'd be honored if you hit that subscribe button. It's free and it helps us keep uncovering stories like Courtney's, one truth at a time.